Okay, so we are going to look at digestive physiology, and this is a really, really good slide. So, be sure to kind of look at it carefully. It kind of gives you, in brief and nice bullets about everything that's going on in the various parts of the digestive tract and the accessory organs. So let's begin with what activities occur in the digestive system. So the first thing is, of course, you take food in through the mouth, and that is known as ingestion. After that, you begin to mechanically break down food. So the first area where that happens is in the mouth, where you chew your food, and the idea is to break it down into smaller particles so that it can be acted upon by the various enzymes. Now, mechanical digestion begins in the mouth, but it continues down when you go into the stomach, because you remember those three layers of the stomach, the muscle layers, the oblique, circular, and longitudinal. What they do is they kind of churn the food around. They kind of, it's almost like a blender. They call the stomach like a digestive blender. So it kind of does churning in the stomach. And then when you go into the small intestine, along with the enzymatic activity which occurs both in the stomach and the small intestine, there is churning, the mechanical digestion in the stomach. And in the small intestine, you have what is called segmentation, where the contents are sort of pushed between two areas. So they're pushed back and forth. And again, that causes a bit of mixing of the contents and aids in mechanical digestion. So that's the second part of the activity which occurs in the digestive system. Then we have propulsion. So right from, the mouth, as you go down, as the food is being mechanically digested, you also need to push it further along. So propulsion is also known as peristalsis. So this is also called peristalsis. It occurs in the pharynx, where the bolus of food is pushed down. Then it goes into the esophagus. So again, in the esophagus, peristalsis occurs. In the pharynx and in the mouth, that area is swallowing. So swallowing is called deglutition. Peristalsis typically occurs from the lower part of the pharynx down. So peristalsis then in the stomach too, and then it goes into the small intestine. And actually in the small intestine, true peristalsis only starts after the nutrients have been absorbed. Everywhere else it pushes the food forward, but in the small intestine, true peristalsis only starts after the nutrients have been absorbed. And that's when you kind of want to push the food forwards into the large intestine. Then we have chemical digestion. This is where the various enzymes will act on the major food groups. So there is enzyme action occurring here. So this chemical digestion begins in the mouth, where we talked of salivary glands earlier. So saliva has enzymes. Then it comes down into the stomach, and again a certain amount of digestion occurs. And then when you come into the small intestine, that's where all the major food groups are digested. And you'll see that as we talk, that only some food groups are digested in the mouth, some in the stomach, but all of them in the small intestine. After food has been chemically digested and broken down into its smallest parts, then you need to absorb the nutrients. And that's where the absorption occurs through the lumen. And carbohydrates, protein, and water go into blood vessels. You remember in the submucosa, you have those large blood vessels which went into the mucosa. So that these carbohydrates, proteins, and water go into the blood vessels. Fats go into lymphatic channels which are known as lacteals, and you saw that in the villus. And then the undigested food goes into the large intestine by the process of defecation, and that is pushed out. So you enter from the mouth and you push it out through the large intestine. Now, during digestive activity, you can see the two main things that happen are secretory activity, which is what brings about chemical digestion, where the enzymes are being secreted, and later you'll see some hormones are secreted which cause the enzymes to be secreted. So in secretory activity, it is the enzymes which are secreted. And these enzymes are secreted either because of a nervous system stimulus or because of hormones which may be produced by the cells of the various gastrointestinal structures. and the motility, which is muscular activity. And here you can see the muscular activity is all of this, the propulsion, the mechanical digestion, all of that is muscular activity. So these are the two main activities, secretory so that you can chemically digest, and muscular activity so that you can mechanically digest and propel the food forward. So let's take a look at this short video on the events which occur.
The primary functions of the digestive system are the breakdown of food, called digestion, and absorption of nutrients. Digestion begins in the mouth, where the teeth break food into smaller particles during mastication. Salivary glands located near the oral cavity secrete saliva, which begins chemical digestion and keeps the food moist. As food is swallowed, the soft palate blocks the upper pharynx to prevent food from entering the nasal cavity, and multiple voluntary muscles in the face, neck, and tongue contract, pushing food particles through the pharynx. The food passes over the epiglottis, which prevents food entry into the respiratory system, and then into the next the pharynx to the stomach. The one-way movement of the food mass, now called bolus, is controlled by wave-like involuntary muscle contractions. This movement is known as peristalsis. The bolus now enters the stomach. Folds in the stomach wall, called rugae, allow for expansion as the stomach fills. Stomach cells secrete caloric antigen, various regulatory hormones that chemically digest the bolus. Muscular contractions in the stomach churn its contents to further break down the bolus and mix it with stomach secretions to form a thick liquid called chyme. Chyme exits the pyloric sphincter and enters the small intestine, the major site of nutrient absorption. The small intestine consists of three parts: the duodenum and ileum. Bile from the liver and digestive enzymes from the pancreas empty into the duodenum to aid in digestion. Absorbed nutrients pass the small intestine into blood and lymph. Chyme not absorbed in the small intestine enters the large intestine. As it passes through the cecum and descending void, water and salts are absorbed and chyme is converted into feces. The rectum stores feces until nervous stimulation initiates the defecation reflex, resulting in elimination through the anal canal.
Okay, sorry, that noise was annoying. I don't know why that was happening. So here you got a good idea of some of the enzymes which are produced and where what type of digestion occurs. So let's look at those now. So first is control of digestive activity. So that activity was what causes secretion and what brings about the muscular activity. So this is either nervous or it is hormonal. So you can see it could be either nervous or hormonal. And this is where all the layers and the cells and the various nerve plexuses you learnt about in the anatomy come into play. So the local nerve plexus, if you remember, in the muscularis externa and in the submucosa, you had these Meissner's and myenteric nerve plexus. This was a local enteric brain, as we call it, local nerve plexus. So nerve, the action of nerve, this is an autonomic, in the sense that it acts on smooth muscle and it acts on the cells. So what will it do? It will act on muscle to produce contraction. It will act on the cells to cause the cells to secrete. So you can see that that's how it will bring about digestive activity. The cells which it acts on, those cells are hormone producing cells. So these hormones producing cells are in various parts of the gastrointestinal tract. Different hormones are produced. And if you remember, we talked of something called enteroendocrine cells. So these enteroendocrine cells in the stomach, they were called G cells and they secreted gastrin. In the small intestine, you have many hormones being produced. Some of which are secretin, cholecystokinin. VIP stands for vasoactive intestinal peptide. We also have something called intestinal gastrin, which is secreted in the small intestine. So this is called intestinal gastrin because it's in the small intestine and not the stomach. So these hormones also bring about digestive activity, which means that they also cause secretion of enzymes or juices, and they also bring about muscle contraction. Remember, that was what digestive activity was. So either it's the nerve or the hormone producing cells. Okay, so these two. Now these are the nerve plexus can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system. If you remember, I said the autonomic nervous system from above, when it comes down, it influences this local nerve plexus with the parasympathetic stimulating it and the sympathetic inhibiting it. So the autonomic nervous system, and here the parasympathetic in the digestive tract is the main sort of system which acts, and it's the vagus of the parasympathetic. So the vagus belongs to the parasympathetic, and that activates or that stimulates the nerve plexus. The sympathetic system mainly causes an inhibition, and for most part the sympathetic system is kind of quiet. It's quiescent. It doesn't act much unless, in some areas it's called upon to play. And along with the autonomic nervous system, we have the central nervous system, various parts where you have emotions and other things which can play a role. Okay? So let's see how all of these play a part. So here is the intestinal wall, and this is the lumen of the intestine. So whatever is present inside the lumen, so when you have food inside the lumen, the food is something which will stretch the intestinal wall. So that will be like a mechanical stretch, okay? So it will activate receptors which respond to stretch or touch. So we call them mechanoreceptors. Then the food may be of low pH, you may have, or high pH, or you may have certain substances inside like caffeine, you may have other things inside, or the food may be hypertonic or maybe hypotonic. You understand, it could be all different kind like that. All of those will influence chemoreceptors and osmoreceptors, which again are present here. And what that does is, so this is the stimulus which is present inside the GI tract. So this is internal GI tract stimulus. So either the presence of food or the pH or the presence of certain substances, they stimulate these receptors, which in turn go and stimulate the myenteric and the Meissner's plexus, which will act on the smooth muscle and glands, and so they will bring about a secretion or contractile activity. So you can see they can bring about digestive activity. This is short, it's restricted to the gastrointestinal tract itself, so these are known as short reflexes. Now the presence of food and all of the other substances, what they can do, the receptors also can go and stimulate the central nervous system, and the central nervous system through the autonomic and especially the vagus, it sends impulses back, which in turn influence the intrinsic nerve plexus. Like I said, the parasympathetic is mainly stimulatory, and that's the one which acts most of the time during digestive activity. So when it stimulates the intrinsic nerve plexus, then again you have stimulation of smooth muscle and glands, and digestive activity takes place. Okay, so that's what happens when food gets into the gut. But sometimes, you've all seen that you start salivating without even thinking about, without even food having touched your stomach, or gastric juices are secreted without even food having touched your stomach. So in these cases, these are external stimuli where there is nothing inside the gastrointestinal tract, but you still have digestive activity. And the external stimuli could be the sight of something very tasty, or even something very nauseous, in which case your activity is depressed. The smell, taste, or even the thought of food. If I started talking about nice juicy steak, or I talked about some really nice dessert, you all will very soon start salivating, right? So that will stimulate. So you can see these external stimuli, they go to the central nervous system, okay? And that stimulates the parasympathetic system, mainly acts on the local nerve plexus and brings about the change. So you can see how all of this acts to finally bring about digestive activity, which is contraction of the muscle and secretion of the gland, And or in some cases it may be inhibition, right? So the secretion is inhibited and the contractile activity is inhibited. So now I talked of those receptors. So where do you think those various receptors are present? When I talked of the chemoreceptors, and you saw in that diagram there, mechanoreceptors. So where do you think those receptors are present? Okay, a few more. Someone's not working. Okay, those receptors are in the walls of the GI tract. Now look at it this way. And that's why paying attention to these images is really good. Look at this, chemoreceptors, GI, internal stimuli. If the stimulus is inside here, it cannot go and stimulate the pons and the medulla. Those receptors are present within the wall because the food is what comes in contact with these receptors, right? That's what will stretch the gastrointestinal tract, and those mechanoreceptors will be stimulated. So they are present here in the walls of the GI tract. The chemoreceptors as well, and as well as the osmoreceptors, okay, in the walls of the GI tract. And where do the cells producing hormones which act on digestive activity lie? So this is just a review. We did this when we were doing the anatomy part. Very good. In the epithelium, remember the epithelium is the one, wherever you have it, this is the epithelium, whether it dips down or forms a villus or is just straight like that. It's the epithelium which is secretory. So if you remember from ANP1, this is the secretory portion. Submucosa has only connective tissue and blood vessels. Connective tissue cannot secrete hormones, okay? Here, remember those enteroendocrine cells? Those cells are part of, and they usually lie deep down up here. So this is where those enteroendocrine cells are. So they're always part of the epithelium. What is the action of the nerve plexuses? Both, yes, very good. So now let's begin with the mouth. So in the mouth we have these various salivary glands. You have tiny little salivary glands sort of sprinkled all over the mouth, but three main glands. So the largest of which is this parotid gland, as we saw when we were doing anatomy. So lies in front of this part of the ear, which is known as the tragus of the ear. This area here, largest gland. It has a duct, the parotid duct, which actually goes right across the face. As you can see here, it pierces a muscle called the buccinator muscle and then opens in the vestibule across the second upper molar tooth. The second gland is the submandibular gland, which peeps just below the mandibular. That's why it's called submandibular up here. Its duct opens, if you lift your tongue up, you get a little crenated fold. It opens over there, this single duct here. And then this gland here, which is also related to the mandible, but just below the tongue. So that's why it's called sublingual. Lingual is for tongue. It has many ducts up here, and all these ducts open again into that part which is known as the frenulum of the tongue. So they open in that little area there. So all of these glands, they produce in saliva, they produce saliva. And in saliva, you have certain important substances which are present. Most importantly, the enzyme amylase is present, and which begins the digestion of carbohydrates. Polysaccharides are carbohydrates. So carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth. Polysaccharides are complex carbohydrates. You want to break them down into disaccharides or little smaller carbohydrates. So along with the chewing, this salivary amylase then will act on it. Saliva also contains a little bit of a fat digesting enzyme called lipase, but this fat digestion is almost negligible. So, I'm just going to put a thing here. It's almost negligible, this fat digestion, but it does have this lingual lipase, as it's called, but it's not really kind of almost worth mentioning. So apart from amylase and this little bit of lingual lipase, what else does saliva produce? Because saliva is really, really important. It produces mucus. The parotid gland, for example, is entirely serous producing, meaning very enzyme rich. Sublingual is mucus producing, so it's a lot of mucus, and the submandibular is mixed. Mucus keeps a neutral pH. It also helps to coat your bolus of food. So it helps to kind of lubricate the mouth and coat the bolus of food so that it can slip back easily along the pharynx. So mucus is produced. It also produces something known as lysozyme, and this is an antibacterial substance. Saliva also contains antibiotic-like substances known as defensins. Another antibacterial substance called nitric oxide is produced. So this is also produced by saliva. So apart from, just lubricating the mouth, causing carbohydrate digestion, you can see it has an antibacterial and antimicrobial action in the mouth, and which is why you don't want your mouth to get dry. You always kind of want your mouth to have some saliva in it. And salivary secretion is controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. And in the parasympathetic, it's the 7th and the 9th cranial nerves, the parasympathetic part which travels with the 7th and the 9th cranial nerves. The 9th supplies the parotid, the 7th supplies the other two, the sublingual and submandibular salivary glands. Now, you may have all heard of a condition called mumps, and when you're a child, you kind of you get vaccinated against mumps. So mumps is an inflammation, a viral inflammation of the salivary glands. And usually seen in the parotid is this area. So the face looks swollen. And the parotid gland is covered. On the surface of the parotid gland, you have fascia, which is very thick and covers it very, very tightly. And that makes mumps very painful because that fascia doesn't allow the gland to expand. So imagine this gland is swollen, but it cannot kind of expand. So that makes it extremely painful. And so, whenever there's secretion, you kind of feel pain at that time. And when mumps occurs later in life, it is, in men especially, it can end up causing what is known as orchitis, which means it affects the testes and causes inflammation of the testes. You're always worried. In a child, it's bad enough in a child, but doesn't lead to orchitis as frequently as it does in older men. So it causes inflammation of the testes, and, it could lead to sterility. So that's one of the kind of complications that may arise with mumps. So which is why, one gets vaccinated against it. Now let's answer this question. What do you think are the consequences of decreased salivary secretion? Very good. 1 and 2 only, not 1, 2, and 3. So there is increased bacterial activity because now you don't have all of those substances being produced. The mouth is dry. The bacteria can, multiply, which is why when your mouth is dry, you also tend to have a bad odor because of this increased bacterial activity. It does make it difficult to swallow. You must have all seen that whenever your mouth is dry. Now it says no carbohydrate digestion possible. Remember, I said carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth, which means that there is carbohydrate digestion occurring somewhere else too. And if you remember, I mentioned that in the small intestine, all food groups are digested. So carbohydrate digestion continues in the small intestine. So it will still occur. It will just be delayed. It will occur in the small intestine. So these are the two things that are the consequences of decreased salivary secretion. So once your mouth, you've chewed the food, the saliva's acted on it, and then now you push it back into the pharynx. So then you begin the process of swallowing, which is also known as deglutition. So in deglutition, if you remember, I said there was one part which was voluntary, so that, you can kind of spit the food out. But once it goes beyond this region of the oral cavity, comes into the oropharynx area, after that, then it becomes involuntary, even though there's skeletal muscle in that part, because remember, respiration is inhibited temporarily. So you do not want respiration to be inhibited for a long time, which is why it quickly passes down. So you see how it'll pass down, and the bolus is coming down, comes down here, comes into the esophagus. The gastroesophageal sphincter is closed, and when the bolus comes close to it, the pressure increases above, opens the sphincter, and that's how the bolus passes into the stomach. Now, in the esophagus, the pH is kept neutral. So, what do you think will happen? Do you think salivary digestion will continue? Salivary amylase can continue to act in the esophagus? Remember, I said mucus, which is secreted by the saliva, keeps the pH neutral or towards the alkaline, more towards about neutral pH, or just very, very, very slightly acidic. In your mouth, the pH is about 6.7 to 7, which is the pH, ideal pH at which saliva acts. Okay, that pH is maintained in the esophagus. So, do you think salivary amylase will continue to act in the esophagus? It will. Right? It can keep acting because now, it's acting in a neutral pH. If the pH is kind of kept at that point, it will continue to act. So digestion continues, or this chemical digestion by amylase continues as the bolus of food is traveling down the esophagus. And then once it comes from the esophagus, it enters into the stomach. Then you get other food groups which are going to begin to be digested. So this again is a really nice slide which kind of gives you every part and what happens in every part. So let's look at the digestion from the inside. So let's review this again.
About 4 weeks' time.
And however well-mannered we are about getting food into our mouths, there's not much decorum about what happens next. To stomach. Your brain has waves of muscular contractions that squeeze things along your esophagus at around 2 inches per second. The first place it reaches is the stomach. Biological and digestive juices to break food into easily absorbed ingredients. Leaving the stomach, things are already unrecognizable. Bile, produced in the liver, is added to help the breakdown of fats. At all stages, the body is extracting the nourishment it needs from the passing flow. The walls of our intestines are a vast surface of cells that absorb proteins, sugars, and fats into our blood. It's these that will provide the energy we need for life.
This was showing you what happens in the stomach as passage through. So you saw, there's only so much. They tell you to chew well so that you can break the food down into smaller particles. When food is broken down into smaller particles, it just makes it easier for the enzymes to act. But even so, you still get pretty solid chunks which fall into the stomach. See here, the stomach, what it does is it literally churns the food like a blender so that food becomes pasty, and that's what is called chyme. And as it is kind of being churned and, sort of made pasty, that's when the enzymes in the stomach will act, okay? And that's what we're going to see now, next. So here in the stomach, some of the things that happen. First is that protein digestion begins here. So we had carbohydrate digestion beginning in the mouth. So here we have protein digestion, which begins. Again, like everything else, remember what brings about digestive activity? You had neural mechanisms, which were the intrinsic nerve plexuses. So these were the nerve plexuses, which may be influenced by the autonomic nervous system. Remember that? And the hormonal mechanisms were the various hormones secreted, and in the stomach you will see it's a hormone called gastrin which is going to be secreted. So both neural and hormonal mechanisms come into play. Second, both cause digestive activity primarily by, what do? In the stomach, they cause secretion of gastric juice, and we'll see what gastric juice contains. And they also cause muscle contraction. Remember, that's what digestive activity was, secretion and muscle activity. So here, gastric juice is secreted from the epithelial cells and muscle contraction occurs. And so let's see what is it that brings about, that stimulates the neural and hormonal mechanisms. So the presence of food. So as the food falls into the stomach was relaxed, but now food falls in. So what it will do, it will result in stretching. Those mechanoreceptors get stimulated, which causes the nerve plexus to be stimulated, which causes secretion and muscle contraction. So that's the neural mechanism. And then from the mouth and the esophagus, the food is at an alkaline pH. You have proteins present, you may have caffeine, you may have other substances which will stimulate the chemoreceptors, and that will cause secretion of the hormone gastrin. So these hormones usually get stimulated by chemoreceptors. So it causes secretion of gastrin from the G cells of the gastric epithelium. They again bring about secretion and muscle contraction. So you can see how both nervous and hormonal bring about digestive activity. Okay. Now, if you remember, in the stomach, we had various parts of the stomach. So if you remember, if I draw the stomach like this, you remember this area was called the fundus of the stomach, right? That's the highest point of the stomach. Usually, I don't know if I mentioned, but gas is present over there because gas always rises to the highest point. Okay. Now, when food comes down here into the stomach, it tends to kind of fall in this area. Some of the food which may lie in the fundus, because the acid which is produced by the epithelium of the stomach, that acid usually doesn't reach that high. So the pH in the fundus tends to be a little higher than the pH elsewhere. So you may, especially when the stomach is really full, you may still find that salivary amylase can continue to act for a little bit till the pH becomes acidic. So it can continue to act in the fundus, okay, because the pH is a little higher than the rest of the stomach area. Also, as food gets in, solid food tends to sort of fall into the main body of the stomach. Liquids tend to pass along the lesser curvature. So liquids travel really fast and they pass out along the lesser curvature of the stomach. Now, remember, there were sphincters which were present. So right here was the gastroesophageal sphincter, which was what kind of a sphincter? Physiological sphincter, yes. So by pressure, it opens and allows food to pass in. And at this point up here, you notice there was another sphincter present. What is the sphincter present between the stomach and the duodenum? Pyloric sphincter, yes. And the sphincters are kept closed by the sympathetic nervous system. So this is the time when the stomach activity is going on. You don't want the sphincter to be open, because if it is open, what will happen? As the stomach is churning, food will come out, right? So the parasympathetic nervous system, its main action is, if you remember, muscle contraction. So it causes contraction of the muscle. So that's how the churning is capable of occurring. But the parasympathetic activity is also to cause relaxation of the sphincter. Right? So when stomach digestion is occurring, both sympathetic and parasympathetic act hand in hand. The parasympathetic causes contraction of the muscle, and the sympathetic acts at the same time on the sphincters, and it keeps the sphincters closed, so that the parasympathetic can act properly, can churn and allow digestion to occur. When the food is ready to be passed out from the stomach into the small intestine, then the parasympathetic activity on the sphincter starts, so it relaxes the sphincter. The sympathetic activity wanes, it comes down. So once it relaxes the sphincter, a small amount of the chyme, the pasty fluid which is produced is known as chyme. That chyme will be allowed to pass into the duodenum. Remember, all these sphincters allow a one-way passage, right? So food only goes from proximal to distal. It cannot go the other way around. So now let's look at what gastric juice contains. So gastric juice is produced by the epithelial cells, you know, the mucous neck cells and all those various cells, the parietal cells and the chief cells. So that's what those cells produce the gastric juice. So gastric juice is produced by the parietal cells. They produce HCl, pepsinogen, which is the inactive form, and intrinsic factor. This HCl needs to be produced because pepsinogen can only be converted into pepsin, an active form. So this pepsinogen gets converted into pepsin only in the presence of acid. That's why it's necessary for the stomach to produce acid. Acid is also needed to denature the proteins. See, proteins are tightly coiled. When you denature the proteins, they unravel. So imagine something which is tightly coiled like this. When it's denatured, then it's opened up, it's unraveled like this. So now it's easy to break the bonds between these various polypeptides or, which make up a protein. Okay, so that's the function. Plus pepsinogen also needs to get activated. And when pepsinogen is activated, it becomes pepsin. The moment pepsin is produced, it actually is a positive feedback mechanism. The presence of pepsin causes pepsinogen to be converted into pepsin. So it kind of becomes a positive feedback loop. And that brings about protein digestion. Intrinsic factor is really important. In fact, the most important function of the stomach is to produce intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is needed for the maturation for the absorption of vitamin B12. So when you take vitamins orally, B12 can only be absorbed in the presence of intrinsic factor. Why is B12 important? It's needed for red blood cell maturation. If intrinsic factor is not present, B12 will not be absorbed. It will lead to a condition known as pernicious anemia. This is treatable. The way you can treat it is you give the person B12 shots. So you give it directly into the bloodstream. After all, where B12 is absorbed, it has to go into the bloodstream. So since it cannot go through the digestive tract, all you do is give them intramuscular shots and it goes directly into the bloodstream. Okay? So let's look at gastric juice.
A medical weight loss program is
as food reaches the stomach, an expandable muscular sac capable of holding from 2 to 4 liters of food and liquids, a number of things happen. Food is mechanically broken apart by the contracting, churning movements of the stomach's muscular walls. The chemical breakdown of food is initiated by the hormone gastrin, which stimulates the secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen from glands lining the walls of the stomach. Pepsinogen is an inactive form of the protein-digesting enzyme pepsin. Pepsin must be secreted in the inactive pepsinogen form in order to prevent it from digesting the cells that produce it. It is the highly acidic conditions in the stomach created by the release of hydrochloric acid that convert pepsinogen into pepsin. Once pepsinogen is converted into pepsin, it breaks proteins down into shorter amino acid chains called peptides. So the stomach itself isn't digested by hydrochloric acid and pepsin. Cells lining the stomach produce a very thick that coats the stomach. However, the protection is not perfect, and cells lining the stomach must nonetheless be replaced every few days due to damage. The result of the mechanical and chemical processes in the stomach is a thick liquid called chyme, consisting of partially digested food and digestive secretions. Peristaltic waves, occurring at about 20-second intervals, propel the chyme toward the small intestine. A circular ring of muscle, called the pyloric sphincter, at the base of the stomach, allows only about a teaspoon of chyme to be released into the small intestine with each way. Depending on the size of the meal, it takes 2 to 6 hours to empty the stomach into the small intestine.
So here you can see that he mentioned, the mucus present, and remember there was the epithelium of the stomach. So you may want to add gastric juice also contains mucus, which is really important because that helps to kind of coat the lining of the stomach and prevent ulceration. And it is when this mucus lining is destroyed by certain drugs, for example, aspirin and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, that people tend to have gastric bleeding or ulcers. Also, we can, if you remember, I told you there was this bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, which was responsible for actually kind of going past this mucus barrier and causing gastric ulcers in many people. Okay? So mucus is rather important. Also, which cell is responsible? I told you which cell was responsible for producing HCl and intrinsic factor. So this was the parietal cell. Which cell is responsible for producing pepsinogen? Chief cells. Yes, very good. Chief cells. Yes. And the stomach is one organ, even though it does not have goblet cells, which usually are the ones which produce mucus. The columnar epithelium of the stomach produces a lot of mucus. So there are no goblet cells in the stomach, but it still produces a lot of mucus so that it can coat itself and prevent being digested by, the acid. Now let's look at some phases of gastric secretion. So there are 3 main phases of gastric secretion. The first is what is called in the head, and this is entirely neural or nervous. So this is nervous in nature. The second is the gastric phase. So it occurs in the stomach. So this is both nervous and hormonal. And the third is the intestinal phase, and this is hormonal. So let's look at these 3 phases. So the first one is called cephalic because it's in the head. The food has not yet gone into your tract. So the sight and thought of food, remember we talked of it, or just the smell of food, or maybe even just a little taste of little bit of food, all of this goes and stimulates brain, the cerebral cortex and or the hypothalamus, and from the cortex the impulses come down to the hypothalamus, which controls the autonomic nervous system and, kind of what's called a part of the brain known as the emotional brain. It goes and stimulates the vagus nerve. So can you see it's nervous in nature? Vagus nerve, so this was the long reflexes, those extrinsic long reflexes. The vagus, which is parasympathetic in nature, part of it carries parasympathetic fibers. That now sends those impulses which come and stimulate the intrinsic nerve plexuses, and gastric juice secretion is brought about. Okay, so here you can see it's entirely nervous because here the cerebral cortex or some other part of the brain is stimulated, which results in the parasympathetic system being stimulated, which comes to stimulate the nerve plexus. So nervous in nature. Next is the gastric phase. The cephalic phase does not always have to occur. And you can see that this is the stimulatory event. There may be inhibitory events. For example, suppose there's a loss of appetite, depression, or, there is you smell something really bad at that time that inhibits the cerebral cortex. There is lack of stimulatory impulses to the parasympathetic system, so the intrinsic nerve plexus doesn't get stimulated. Let's look at the gastric phase, which is when food comes into the stomach and the part that we just described. So your stomach gets distended because of the presence of food, which stimulates the intrinsic nerve plexuses and also stimulates the chemicals there will stimulate the gastrin cells. So gastrin is released. Here the local reflexes are brought about. The intrinsic, the presence of food can also go all the way around. Remember the long reflex, so it will stimulate the vagus, which again will stimulate the local nerve plexus. So here both nervous and hormonal, they cause the gastric epithelium to release gastric juice. So here you have gastric juice being secreted. Now, once the stomach has kind of digested, begun, and it's broken down the food and made it into a pasty fluid which is known as chyme. And as you saw in that video, this chyme, only a little bit is pushed out once it's kind of, gotten really pasty. The pyloric sphincter relaxes and about a teaspoonful, as he said, about 3 ml is pushed out into the duodenum. Can you think of why only 3 ml at a time goes into the duodenum? Why don't you have the whole pyloric sphincter open and all of the gastric contents go into the duodenum? I mean, what's the point of waiting over there? Think, what is the pH here in the stomach? Acidic or alkaline? Acidic, right? So, and the duodenum, imagine if you kind of open the pyloric sphincter and sent all of the gastric contents into the duodenum, you'll have so much acid coming into the duodenum. Can you understand that it will completely erode the duodenum, right? The duodenum it can only neutralize the acid which comes little at a time. Okay, so that's the reason you don't have all of the chyme coming at one onslaught. You have little bit at a time. So when that chyme comes into the intestine, initially, just for a brief period, what happens is this presence of partially digested food, it distends the duodenum, and the duodenal mucosa, the epithelium, secretes a hormone which is called intestinal gastrin, or also known as enteric gastrin. And remember, the activity of gastrin is to increase gastric juice production. So this intestinal gastrin has a brief period of activity, so it causes increased gastric activity. But you want that activity to stop, because if it keeps happening, what will happen? The pyloric sphincter will open and more of the chyme will come out, right? So this is very, very brief. After that, what happens is the gastric juice secretion is inhibited so that the duodenum can actually neutralize whatever little bit has come, and then again the pyloric sphincter will open. So this brief effect of gastric juice secretion is followed by inhibition of gastric juice secretion. And that inhibition is brought about by, so now food has come into the duodenum, there is acidic food, it's fatty, there may be irritants in the duodenum, and the duodenum gets distended. So what happens is that it inhibits the local reflexes, it inhibits the vagus, but it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. So this is known as the enterogastric reflex. Entero meaning from the intestine to the stomach. So the enterogastric reflex. So it inhibits local reflexes, so no more gastric juice secretion. Inhibits the vagus. So again, vagus can't stimulate the gastric juice secretion. It stimulates the sympathetic nervous system so that the pyloric sphincter becomes tightly closed, right? And so no more chyme comes in. Also at this time, it causes release from the intestine of certain other hormones which are known as enterogastrones. So these hormones are secretin, cholecystokinin, vasoactive intestinal peptide, and all of them, they inhibit stomach gastric juice secretion. So you can see for a while gastric juice secretion is inhibited. And then the effect passes off, and again little bit more chyme comes into the duodenum. So that's why little at a time is coming into the duodenum, so that the duodenum gets time to neutralize this acid, highly acidic medium which has come in. Okay? So here are the phases as a review. So the cephalic, it's in the head, it's entirely nervous. So just the thought, smell, sight of food, a little bit of taste. The vagus is stimulated through the CNS, and that goes and stimulates the nerve plexus, which brings about gastric juice secretion. The gastric phase, which involves both hormonal and nervous. So when food is in the stomach, the stretch and the chemicals cause stimulation of gastric and the nerve plexus. And also the stretch can go right up to those long nerve plexuses. So both the vagus also can get stimulated, which in turn will cause the nerve plexus to be stimulated. So you have a lot of gastric juice secretion. And then the intestinal phase, when food goes into the intestine. So initially it is excitatory because of the intestinal gastrin. But then you have an inhibitory phase where the enterogastric reflex inhibits vagus and nerve plexuses. It stimulates the sympathetic nervous system so that the pyloric sphincter is closed. And also there is secretion of all these hormones, secretin, cholecystokinin, vasoactive intestinal peptide, which inhibit gastric secretion. So that's why this is called enterogastric reflex. Entero meaning the intestine to the stomach, gastric, so enterogastric reflex. So let's look at these phases of gastric secretion.
Regulation of stomach secretion is divided into 3 phases: cephalic, gastric, and intestinal. In the cephalic phase, the taste or smell of food, tactile sensation of food in the mouth, or thought of food sends nervous impulses to the medulla oblongata. These impulses cause parasympathetic neurons via the vagus nerves to stimulate secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin in the stomach. The parasympathetic stimulation also results in secretion of gastrin from the lower part of the stomach. This hormone travels through the bloodstream and further stimulates hydrochloric acid and pepsin secretion in the upper and middle parts of the stomach. In the gastric phase of gastric secretion, food has entered and distended the stomach. This distension activates a parasympathetic reflex via the medulla oblongata and also has a direct stimulatory effect on the gastric glands. The result is continued secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin. In the intestinal phase of gastric secretion, chyme has entered the duodenum, so gastric secretion is no longer needed. When the chyme contains lipids from the digestion of fats or contains enough hydrochloric acid to bring its pH below 2, gastric secretion is inhibited. The lipids and hydrogen ions inhibit gastric secretion by 3 simultaneous actions. First, they cause impulses to go to the medulla oblongata to decrease parasympathetic stimulation of the gastric glands. Secondly, they set up local reflexes via neurons in the wall of the gut that decrease gastric secretion. Thirdly, they cause the release of 3 local hormones which travel via the circulation to the gastric glands and inhibit their secretion.
Now, hydrochloric acid, which is really important, there are 3 things which control hydrochloric acid secretion. One is the neural through the parasympathetic, then the hormone gastrin, and we also have cells in the lining of the stomach which produce histamine. And histamine also causes hydrochloric acid secretion, which is why when people have gastric ulcers or they have acid reflux where they're producing a lot of acid, you give them drugs which are antihistaminics. They are not the same that you give for allergies, but these act against the histamine receptors and they prevent this histamine from being released. You may have heard of drugs called cimetidine and ranitidine, all of this, which have the idine at the end of it. So that's how these drugs act. I already mentioned that mucus barrier, how we have this thick layer of mucus produced by the cells of the stomach, and that is so that it's coated so the stomach is not digesting itself. It's a very, very protective layer. And aspirin and other what are called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they disrupt this barrier. That's why they always tell you whenever you take aspirin or you take ibuprofen or any of these things, take it on a full stomach. Do not take it on an empty stomach, because prostaglandin is something which which helps in mucus secretion, and they disrupt this prostaglandin synthesis. So they disrupt the mucus barrier, and that's how they cause bleeding. Helicobacter pylori also can damage this mucus barrier and kind of burrow its way in between the cells, and that's how it causes gastric ulcers. So let's do a bit of review. What brings about gastric juice secretion? Yes, very good. All of them. Gastrin, local nerve plexus, and then parasympathetic acting on the local nerve plexus and bringing about this secretion. Now, in the stomach, you remember I said there's a lot of churning going on. So this is the activity. So you can see peristaltic waves kind of moving from the pylorus coming towards the pyloric valve, which is closed, and then, it goes kind of swishes back and forth. So there's a lot of vigorous peristaltic action which occurs. And then when the food is kind of broken down into chyme, at that point, this pyloric sphincter kind of opens up, and a little bit of chyme passes, kind of is squirted out at each wave. And actually, in the wall of this stomach, you have pacemaker cells. And these pacemaker cells, they kind of bring about these contractions about 3 per minute. So they help, just like we had a pacemaker in the heart. So similarly, we kind of have a pacemaker in the stomach, these pacemaker cells. So they kind of bring about this activity, and about 3 waves per minute is what they do. And that's how they make sure that only 3 ml it gets squirted out, which with passage into the duodenum, so that the duodenum is not flooded with a lot of acidic medium, and it's incapable of then handling it, and then you'll end up with getting duodenal ulcers. Okay. Why does salivary amylase continue to act on the food in the esophagus? Yes, because the pH is still neutral, and in the same with the fundus, when you have a lot of food, so it can still act there. What is the primary function of the sphincters? Very good. Just ensure that substances pass only when needed to, and also little at a time. You don't push the whole thing through all at once. Okay, so we'll stop here.